All right, I just got back, but I'm very hungry, so I wanted to talk some of my thoughts. So I'm recording. Uh, Basically, everything that I've been talking about, he agreed with and had slides already prepared from his 8 years of trying to convince people to work on this. He emphasized the two different paths: the private sector, the government sector. He said he's been working on both, but primarily he thinks the private sector will be my best way of going, as long as I can convince people to. Well, really, as long as we can get the ball rolling in terms of pulling in money for storing data, then we can build out the funding needed to work on the data interfacing and integration. And then, as you mentioned, it kind of scales outward because you have the data that you need to, the customer base you need to be, funding that. And it becomes cheaper the more you have and so on. That explanation he gave. In the government sector stuff, there is a possibility we could do something there. He's going to get back to me on it. But we have to refine the pitch a lot so that it's on the private sector side more concrete, more tangible, more of a 5-year plan. The government side of things, we need to hone down on a smaller scope. How do we test data integration on random data sets across scope to prove that it's worth investing more broadly? Let's go eat. We'll do the rest after.
I just realized you can't fucking hear me. Damn it.
Okay, so we have a bagel and a toaster and some coffee and stuff. The meeting was great. I have a lot of things going around in my head, a lot of thoughts that I want to try to get down into something formed, but I'm just going to get all the stuff in my head out there right now with you guys. What amazed me most about this was how consistent the thought process, the language, the problem definitions, and everything was between he and I's notes. He had given talks recently, in fact, where the language describing this problem was extremely consistent with mine. Some of it more focused in geospatial data science, since that's what he was presenting on. But easily one of the few people in the world that have expressed to both government and private sector the need to address this. Data integration, he agreed and kind of exasperatedly, agreed with me that we're wasting so much money and time going back and finding the databases and assembling the team that can find how to fuse them and then building a way to fuse them so we can build the specific inference that we're going to make for this one project, and then nothing ever comes of that. And all the things that I don't want to go into again because I'd be repeating a lot of the conversation, but just to get onto his feedback, we essentially outlined two possible paths, right? There's the private sector of, we're going to help you better curate and interface with training data, where there's certainly a market, but you have to be competitive against traditional storage of data. Excuse me. And, the use cases of things like hyperspectral data sets and, more advanced sensor information are only starting to grow now, right? When private sector wants to take advantage of some information from these kinds of data sets, for example, the one that we talked about a lot, which is currently being done, is hedging on agriculture, for example, right? So you use sensor data to make an assessment of, the crop yield in a certain region and place hedges on that, right? You have the best information sooner than even the market. So those kinds of situations, right? You're a mix of, being the most up to date and accessible, and then like a very shallow degree of interfaceability, right? And then on the flip side, in the government sector, you have tons and tons and tons and tons of pre-existing data, and they're constantly throwing money at the discrete methods to fuse and utilize them. And you can't really motivate a mass, systemic architectural change that would result in a consistent or standardized method of storing and interfacing with that data without, ultimately justifying it um, to a immediate cost or program, which is difficult when most of those are going to be better off in the short term in their mind spending the money on what they need immediately, which is that inference. I'll go grab the bagel. Problem is, even if you have all of that stuff stored in one place in a peer-to-peer network, you still have to build individual tools to interface with each type of data set. The problem is how you index it. And that's where I pose that, well, if we have a standard underlying manifold latent space that everything is embedded in, then we can train an unsupervised model to determine the vital indices and the way of indexing for any particular problem, right? If you have a network of science ancestry and your question is,
Oops. Well, that sucks. I hate having to repeat what I said. That's why I'm live, but you were the same input. All right. I'm just gonna finish this and I'll try to reform my thoughts again. All right. So the meeting went great. I recorded a couple thoughts, but I accidentally set it up incorrectly, so I'll rephrase. I think certainly the best aspect of this was that a lot of the language, the thought processes, the problem definitions
Tinker's time is
between
1 p.m. ET.
His work and his discussions, and even a talk that he recently gave that he showed me, and my own were very similar. And the more I talk to people in different aspects of this industry and this problem, the more I'm reinforced that this is the underlying issue limiting what we can and will end up being able to do with machine learning. And because the problem has so many different invested parties, there's a few different ways we can approach this, right? And so the end of our conversation kind of started to point a couple of these different paths out, right? We could approach this from the private sector and build up enough investment to start by serving as a data storage service. And as you scale something like that, it becomes significantly cheaper to operate. And what you then do is work with those organizations to start to curate those data integration and knowledge interfaces and work from there, right? The other aspect of it, and we're kind of going to be hitting both of these in the end, is using the government side and emphasizing to national labs and organizations that have these disparate data sets that they're constantly spending money to connect. I realize this is stuff that I talked about when I was muted, so let me hash that again after I get through this, and encourage them to start testing data integration methodologies so that we can eventually apply them to these much larger data sets that we are taking action with. So what's also very satisfying is, we came to the same conclusions in terms of the underlying problem, right? Even if you have all this information stored in a perfect peer-to-peer network, the problem is how you index it, right? Is how do you search through it? How do you interface with it, right? And this is where I brought up my point of what we want to be able to do is in an unsupervised manner. I had of course, anytime I talk through something off the cuff, I have a great explanation for it. And then whenever I lose that footage or it's muted or whatever, and I have to redo it, I'm awful at explaining it a second time. Awful. Just by the nature of having to do it a second time. My brain doesn't like doing it. I can't even remember the way I explained it. This is why I want to get my thoughts out as soon as I got home, and then let's draw this out. I'll land. I'll get there eventually. Sorry, this is gonna be a long video then. I'm annoyed with myself. I didn't have the screen scene up, and so it didn't. The audio wasn't there, even though the video was. Okay. Let me grab my iPad. The point I was getting at was that, let's say you're dealing with like hyperspectral data, right? You take your image, right, and then your bands with depth, and then time, let's say, is on that axis, right? And you're gonna compile that into 2 columns, right? And you're gonna encode that the tabular data, right, onto your storage, onto your memory. I should check through my other recordings to see if I wasn't audible since I had done that. So yeah, let's say what we're dealing with here. You can see that, yeah? Hyperspectral data set, right? So you have your pixels, right? And then you have your bands. And then we'll say in this direction you have time, right? So if you're doing a time series, then you're going to go across this direction, pinpoint your 2D image for every band, and then segment that out, right? And, you end up with some Y1 or X1, Y1 kind of tabular series, right, that you then encode on your hardware. Okay. And of course, it's not updating at all. I love OneNote, but I really wish they did better about streaming what you're writing on the tablet immediately to the screen. Sometimes it's instant, other times it's not. So we have our hyperspectral data, right? We have our pixels. It's going to be a lot more crude because it's harder to draw on this. You have your bands, and then you have your time. That's what I was drawing while I was talking there. All right. And you end up with your tabular data. Just whatever it is. The point being that you're going to pay a scientist, right, to go and grab data from here, from here, from here, from here, and they're going to go file by file, pulling out these columns, right, and arranging it in a way that they can consistently work with, all right? And for any one data set, right, type, right, that's an image, right, you have a spectra, you have some text, right, you have just a tabular series, whatever it might be, you're going to have to combine these in a distinct way for each occasion, right? See if I can get this in. So a lot of these projects, and a lot of even the ones that I'm working on, we have this problem that requires dataset 1, dataset 2, dataset 3, and some other datasets that we're not really sure about yet. We haven't discovered that these will be helpful. And this is going to come from org 1, org 2, org 3, right? And as I mentioned in our previous discussion, like a lot of our time is just spent trying to figure out how to connect these, contacting the people that we need, getting the data into one place, and then figuring out how we're going to get all of that into one Python script or whatever we need in order to do our final output. I mean, like 90% of the work is that process, right? And thinking of everything in this line and ultimately missing most of it, right? So, what's happening right now is we have all these different government labs with all these different interests, but some kind of manifold or shared, contribution that they could make to one problem, now having to do this ping-ponging, right? And for the first time in forever, essentially, we are now not just building models. Oh, Jesus, it's not, the writing ain't going to be great. It's weird to write on the surface that I don't see the actual lines being drawn on, you know what I mean? You have the models being built not because we have the data already, right? And we're like, oh, how do we sort through this data? But we're expecting a significant amount of data, right? And so we're building the models to prepare for the data, or we're doing them at the same time, right? And what's ultimately happening is you're funding these massive teams, millions of dollars is going to curating that data for this particular use case, and you're doing the same thing again for another use case, and the same thing again for another use case, and ultimately you never actually connect them, unless maybe you have some one person that contributed to both in the same kind of way. It's so much wasted effort, and anybody you talk to in these interest areas agrees with this. I mean, it's kind of an obvious problem, right? I've heard the word zoo, mess, annoyance. It's because it's the way it is. It's what we can do, right? Okay, so let's say we're in an ideal world and we have a peer-to-peer network of universities, national labs, private sector organizations, right? All of these different entities sharing a universal data set. And let's say we've done the basics of, organizing it by basic filters, right? And a fundamental amount of labeling, right? Not any more labeling than we have now. Just the basic, this is an image of this. Here's the number of pixels, blah, 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 blah. The challenge now becomes, I have this massive data. How do I index it? And I didn't use this word before, but he used this word, and I like it because it's an easy. I always use how do you interface, but that's too broad. Index is very okay, I want to get this data. How do I index it, right? Well, for an image, I know I need to go X and Y, and so each of those is a pixel, and then that pixel is that spectra. Okay, so this is my data. Okay, but for every instrument, you have a different number of bands. Okay, so measure that. Oh, but now what if it's asymmetric, or what if it's masked? Or, okay, what if, I have one band here and one band not here? And what if the data here is bad? All of those sorts of problems, right? It becomes, the entire field of remote sensing, right? So how do we index it? Well, to me, you can sit there and you can build a different head, a different filter, a different method for every different data set, right? Which, as I mentioned last time, is not viable, right? You want this to be future-proof, expandable. If you're creating a unique way of interfacing with everything that's unique, then you're back to the same problem that we are now, where we're just recurating all of that information to begin with, right? And so you need something that's manifold, right? So you need a shared latent space that's manifold, right? So one shared embedded, one universal embedding space, one standard. And this is what we kind of landed on. Here's the key is we have the technology for the peer-to-peer network, right? We have the capacity to start building the models that will interface with that network, right? And work with it and use it, right? And we have the compute. We're throwing money in the compute right now. But every single AI person that you talk to that's actually using this stuff will tell you the problem is the data. The data is not curated well, and every time we want to do something, we have to recurate it, right? So how do we do this? Well, you need something that all of those different types of data sets share, right? And one could say, okay, time. Well, okay, they're all taken at a certain time, or maybe they're all taken at a certain space. Okay, maybe they all have some kind of temperature because they're all some objects. But you could keep going, and you can never fully explain every single scenario, right? And so that's the challenge, is what's the manifold? What's the shared universal property that we can form a standardization around? And then once you have a standard way of indexing all kinds of data, right, a standard format to work with. Think of it like headers in a tabular series, right? If you have 10 different organizations using 10 different headers, you have to go and discretely figure out which each of those differences are. If you have a standard, right, it now becomes significantly easier to data fuse from diverse sectors and from different servers and so on and so forth in different contexts, right? So how do we encourage the use of a standard? We either create some kind of, and this is what I've talked about last time, is unit, right? We create some type of standard that describes all different types of domains in a fundamental latent space that any kind of data can embed in, right? And it doesn't decrease the integrity and the fidelity of the information that you get from that data. It does its best to compress it, and it will allow it to be evolved easily without having to add new tabular series to it. And it will also, all of those things that we talked about last time. Or you just say, government or big company or whatever, hey, we're going to do this, and so if enough people are going to join us, we might as well all do it, right? And there's also, my dad pointed out, after having this conversation in this meeting, I chatted with my dad because he's somewhat adjacent to this stuff. He was like, hey, standards organizations are a thing. You could talk to organizations that build standards and say, why don't we have a standard for the latent space, so the way that we embed this information, the way that we interface, with this kind of data, so that we can train machine learning models in a uniform way without having to constantly recurate, right? And so this is where the conversation left off. Is we have a bunch of different ways of approaching the government side of this. We have a bunch of different ways of approaching the private sector side of this. We have a bunch of different ways to do independent research to advance it. And we even have going and approaching it from the perspective of, hey, encouraging the formation of a standard, right? They have their ups and downs, right? With the private sector, we need to have some kind of financial backing, and we need to have a really concrete business plan of, we're going to have these customers for this, we're going to get this ROI, we're going to expand to this, and along with that, we're going to be developing this technology that sets a precedent for a standardization of a uniform and manifold-driven latent space that all different data domains can be encoded in. And the key here is that as long as you do enough effort to, kind of like HDMI, right? HDMI isn't perfect. It's not. You technically lose a lot of data throughput when you plug in an HDMI, but because enough companies agreed to use it, it became a very helpful tool, right? Because if you needed to plug in your monitor, you generally had the cable and the outlet, right? In the circumstance now, we have things like DVI, right? We have better alternatives because HDMI either wasn't built to be future-proof enough or wasn't innovated in the process, right? Excuse me. So we have the same potential risk coming up, right? And I used the example of like AC/DC or with networking, with we went from phone lines to UTB and all of that, right? We're throwing money at the compute, right? We have peer-to-peer networks, and we technically have the data storage capability. We could take all of the hyperspectral data, all of the reconnaissance assets, everything, and put it in one place, in theory. We still don't have the way to index it. We still don't have the way to interface with it. This is the problem, is these are really not useful. Right? We've already established that LLMs and traditional transformer-based models can only scale so much. And the only way to breach past that is with unique data and unique data interpretations. Well, the only way to form those unique data interpretations is to have that method of taking that data to a token or some kind of interpretable latent space, right? Well, the only way to do that is to have some method of going through this massive data set and finding the way that they all connect. Okay, well, the only way to do that is to have some unsupervised method, right, that targets the manifold properties and builds a model for how to trace them down, right? And so this is where we hit this kind of endpoint in the discussion where it's like, okay, so the problem is we need a uniform latent space. We need some shared standard to encode in. And we want it to be as interpretable. We want it to be as expandable as possible, as future-proof as possible. We also want it to be interpretable. Ideally, it's not one of these vague, middle spaces of data where we don't really know how to understand it, but we can create outputs from it. No, it needs to be built around some known physical structure or some consistent uniform format so that there is some logic to it. But what I posed after that is okay, I'm addressing that. My solution to this is that once you build this network and you integrate the data enough, you can now use unsupervised methods to go and trace the manifold properties. And by the very nature of how our observation and our science connects, those manifold properties will trace down to a root, a fundamental mechanism. It won't necessarily be the root, but we'll have many of the elements leading up to it and many of the things close to the observation that you have. As long as you have enough pieces in the dots, and an unsupervised learning model that is working in a universal latent space across all kinds of knowledge that is as interpretable as possible could be a foundation for legitimate learning. Right? Because now you can actually take advantage of the fundamental models that we use to create new knowledge that then we put through the filter of interpretation like language that we then use to train those, LLMs. So that is the big barrier. Like every discussion I've had, whether it's someone in the private sector, whether it's someone in government, whether it's somebody high up, in a national lab, whether it's somebody building the models right now, whether it's somebody funding the point is every single person I've talked to about this comes to the same end result, where it's like, okay, this sounds amazing, we would love to have it, but every time I try to do it, I'm working against the organizational limitations, right? For the government sector, you're trying to encourage a small national lab or a small team that's been funded to do this one and address this one problem, to think for the longevity of all these other problems that the government is working on, and unless you then fund a thing dedicated to curating data, which we are, but then you're doing it in a specific context and still only curating in a particular standard, a particular way. You're not actually standardizing. You're not actually reaching outward, right? In the private sector side, you have to actually get funding for it and stay profitable. And so what you really need to be is a data storage thing. So you're doing peer-to-peer data storage to try to pay to develop a new way to interface with it. Well, ultimately, you're in competition with something like AWS or whatever, right? Well, you could be an organization that goes to another organization that has disparate data servers and build them that peer-to-peer network, but then you're still asking for a lot of overhead to develop that methodology. And so every single one of these organizations independently could massively, massively benefit. I mean, we're talking, multitude factors more than what the actual GPU market has benefited from in terms of this, right? Because we're unlocking this whole new regime of data interpretation that isn't just the advertisement of agentic stuff, which is, we can now, connect this line of wording to this program that you wrote. No. We're talking about developing bespoke methodologies on the fly automatically as it is learning, and then using that method of learning so that we can interface with the very same information that it's deriving that inference from. We're talking about a two-way street, which has only been possible in the transformer era recently, with strongly focused on attention mechanisms, right? And how we can start to figure out where it's learning the important aspects of the data are. But unless we have a resource and a network that traces every actual component of the source of that observation and the mechanisms that we suggest led to it, then we couldn't ever fill that whole gap. It's it's really satisfying to hear that so many other people have come to the same conclusion independently for other reasons and talk to the government about it, but nobody seems to want to budge. And it's like, why haven't we? Well, it's one of those, you need to invest too much time and energy and too much time and money to get the snowball going, or you need to be influential enough and interconnected enough to get the snowball going to begin with. And then at that point, it's a standardization issue. It's like, how do you get enough people working on the problem to come up with something that everybody can agree with is good and worth working on? Or are you a large company, private sector organization that then is just going to try to sell your standard as the way to go, but then you have to control most of the market for it to be viable? And this is definitely a problem that would be most ideally solved by doing all of it at the same time, working on the private sector interests by curating the peer-to-peer network so they get used to working with that kind of customer base, and then talking with them about how they're going to access that data, and then making bespoke methods for that using that underlying method, right? And adventuring into what could we use as a manifold, whether it's going to be a topological method or something more derived in a smaller dimensionality that's then scoped according to what part of the context you're interested in. Either way, it's going to have to be paired to something that's profitable. On the government side of things, you could definitely throw lots and lots of money at developing something unique like this, but then actually getting people to want to scale it, right, is a dramatic problem of working against the systems that they're already accustomed to using. And you can't really do that unless, again, you already have the snowball going. It's like a chicken and the egg problem here. And so, although there's opportunities that we have to get a lot of money and funding just through direct government funding, and then there's also the path of trying to push a private sector organization through this, and then we have the kind of the third thing, which is approaching it from the standards perspective. I mean, all of these are viable, and he brought up something that stuck with me, which was that he was doing this 8 years ago, and it was way too early. He thinks that even now it's a little bit too early, and I think I said this when I was muted, and it's because although they're realizing they're running out of data and they need more derivatives for the inferences, the sectors that are using that kind of information are few and far between. I don't know if I mentioned the hedge hedging on agriculture when I was muted or not, but I'll say it now in case I didn't. One of the interest areas that he's seen used is, placing hedged bets on, agricultural data. So you can go to a particular region and look at the crops, and now you are able to make a better hedge on, crop futures, right, for that particular region. So that's a niche use case. But if you think about the kind of actionability that we're requiring in most commercial sectors, it doesn't go that broad yet. And they're just now starting to get the sensors into their systems so that they can have these feedback loops. The kind of feedback loop that we're talking about is a much more broad thing that they're probably not going to be thinking about for another 5, 10, 15 years. However, I am at a perfect time to be prepared for that. And that's the key, is like, we can approach all three of these different avenues, but we need to refine these concepts a lot, right? But if the conclusions is anything, it's that all of the experts agree the problem is creating a fundamental, standardized, universal latent space that all types of data can boil down to. Once we have a universal way of indexing, we can start building models that interface with that data network and inherently begin to learn how things connect. Once we have a model that's trained on how to do that, we have the path that we need to build a human interface that is then LLM integrated or Curie or whatever it might be, right? We're talking about using the process of unsupervised learning to figure out how we would sort through in a supervised way, which is kind of obvious and hitting the nail on the head, but it's like, why hasn't somebody thought of this? Maybe somebody has. This is why I like putting these videos out. Because, in terms of accessing information, most people think first to use the internet. But then they go into okay, where am I going to get that data? Okay, now how am I going to get that data from the format they present it into the format I want? Well, if that's the very problem every single time, then why aren't we addressing that at the root, right? And with this Chrome and Google and OpenAI stuff coming up, I'm starting to worry that I might be too late, right? Because the worst case scenario in my brain is we get a bunch of money in this technology because of the hype, but then they throw it all at compute and then they put no effort into the data infrastructure and data curation and fusion and all of that. And then the government is like, okay, wait, we want to actually do something with this and we can't with what you've made? What the fuck? We have to, most of our money is being spent still the exact same way it always has been, right? Because the problem hasn't been the compute, it hasn't been the model methodology necessarily, it's been getting the data. And then you have the private sector who's going to run out of that momentum, and they're going to need to grab onto something in order to address the kind of application space that, is going to end up being viable beyond just the slop era. And well, they're going to either have to throw money at it or they're going to work within the infrastructure they already have, the way data is stored, and build their own bespoke methods of curating with it that then we're going to have to just settle into, and then you don't have the viability for the long run. You don't have the universal integration, and you've built the infrastructure too late. You've built DC current instead of AC current. You put phone lines in instead of Ethernet. You know what I mean? You built it from the ground up the wrong way, and now we're going to have to backtrack. Hey, Manly Mutt. It'd be fun. Nobody would listen to that. I'm posting this on YouTube. That's why I'm recording. I'm just trying to get my thoughts out from this meeting. It was really good. Other things that we talked about. Yeah, and he working at IBM, there are several examples of this kind of thing that we called it my vision, and we once we figured out that we were talking about the exact same thing, we didn't have to go through all the context again, which was nice. But they're, again, just discrete. They're for a particular purpose, and all of the times he's tried to encourage effort on the government side to do this, that those same barriers come up, and then on the private sector side, it's like, well, then you have to have the private sector interests in mind. And the other avenue is, of course, creating a standard that's so good that people just start using it, which is like, okay, why don't I get the funding to build, like the home lab we have here, one at each university or one at each national lab, put a small team at each or a small team that works for each, and a different kind of data set at each and say, okay, it doesn't matter what the data is, as long as it's the right type, start thinking about a manifold, a model that finds the manifold. Start thinking about a uniform latent space that all of this data can be indexed through, and spend a few years just developing that side at a small scope. Or on the flip side, you start focusing on building up a network so large that the scope is then it becomes inevitably obvious to do that. Like you could attack it from either direction, you know what I mean? Depending upon the interest area that you're working from. Did I miss anything? Well, this is going to be long, so I think I've gotten all of the important thoughts out. Man, it's encouraging to hear people so much smarter and more interconnected than I that have been thinking the exact same stuff. After seeing everything going on, it's just to hear that we're all kind of at the same stopping point. It's like, fuck, okay, all right, but yeah, it's definitely, this is the right time. If I continue to be vocal about this and make the right connections and sell the idea to the right people, as long as we get enough support behind it, the snowball starts to grow, right? And then we can have the best minds of the world working on the right latent space embedding standardization, and work outward from there. But it's to build that momentum is I need to dedicate myself to one way or the other if I need to build the momentum. I can't just expect the momentum to be built in both at the same time. So we'll see. He seemed to be receptive of the fact that I was right on the same wavelength, pun intended. And he is actively working on a substantial grant. So we could end up with a good amount of money to do this, but I'm not going to hinge on that. And I'm also not going to hinge on government funding for the data curation stuff, because it just feels like they're already so sunk on throwing money where is perceived as advantageous, which is in the compute and the servers and the blah blah blah, what the companies think they need, because in their brain, to make a consumer product right now, you just need text, audio, video, the slop stuff. And I don't see very many organizations, Archetype AI I mentioned already, really thinking about the long term of what's going to change the game, and what's going to start bringing about models that can capably learn to take action and develop new, novel interpretations of fundamental mechanisms that we can then use to make our own new interpretations. I mean, that's genuine learning. That's the stuff that they will continue to try to sell you through models that are trained on text without ever addressing the elephant in the room, which is the lack of that traceability back to our fundamental understanding of reality. And so I argue again, no AGI will ever take form until this problem is solved, right? And then once you have this, you have the basis for a self-learned system that could take up any spot in any fiction movie that Will Smith has to fight against, or whatever else you want. I mean, that is when shit gets real, in my opinion. You don't have anything significant until you get to that point where the data accessibility is so convenient that an automated pipeline could self-learn to interface with it. And then you not only allow, humanity to have access to that knowledge traceability in an unprecedented way instantly for any application they need, but then you have that for any model you want to create. And then the compute is your limiting factor. Compute is not our limiting factor anymore. We know that we can keep throwing GPUs at the problem and it's not going to get any better, or it's not going to get that significantly better. This is how you break through that, and without hitting a ceiling ever again. And people agree with me. I just don't have the money. I forgot to mention this. So one of the papers that I found that I'm going to be looking into for the next week or so, I thought this was interesting. Topological deep learning. So graph convolutions were of interest to me for a number of reasons, in terms of maintaining context in a latent space for UVC gone. We were looking at it. Oh, they're Purdue. Oh, that's funny. I didn't know it was Purdue. This is interesting because dimensionally it can scale to any extent. And in theory, you could build a unique latent space for every like connection that makes up the topology of that knowledge traceability. And then as you zoom in, right, when you get higher resolution, you're going to more finite and discrete interpretations, or you're going to more fundamental models. You go outward, you're going to more higher level observations, right? And the way they connect that surface, that manifold, you can, graphically, you could take any one plane, right, and the way that it connects and go perpendicular to it, right, encode it or compress it into that latent space on that axis, on that dimension, and maintain only what's relevant to that half of the traceability. You could flip it the other way, and you could say, okay, at this scale and from this side, let's say I'm doing time on the. When you're talking about every possible connection between a data set, you need a way to scope according to what you're trying to study, and then project it into the space that you're studying within, right? So if you had, 50,000 hyperspectral data sets and 15 of them had a high resolution image at a low scale, and then 5 of them had a Google Street View, and then 10 were radar, right? Taking all of the different parts of those data sets that could be easily connected either through time or space, or through a temperature, or through some kind of data set or some kind of manifold mechanism, whatever it might be, we can't know until we have it. You would have to find a way to ignore what isn't necessary, right? And you can only do that if you can find an interpretable latent space to project into, because otherwise you're you could only really set like a fall off. You could say, okay, once you reach a certain level of specificity, it's no longer, but that's not how knowledge operates, right? You can't say a specificity, you can't say dimensionality, you can't say fidelity, you can't use any real descriptor because you could be going in either direction. So I've been looking at this, I'm going to read through this, it's way over my fucking head, but it does feel like the right solution would entail having some kind of fundamental model for the extent to which a connection between two things is helpful. And that has to scale with from what perspective you're looking at it, which can only be driven by how the model learned to approach that thing. And if there are models that can apply attention according to a particular constraint on that topology, then in theory you could map this out in a way that's interpretable because it's graphically something that you could scale in and out from, as opposed to conceptually varying. Kind of like how the vectors help you see the LLM style. It's really loosely connected in my brain right now, but I want to read through this and look at what are precedent methods for uniform and standard embedding spaces. What kind of latent spaces are used in models? When you get higher in dimensionality, how more complicated does that get? And who's working on this? Because this is way outside of my regime, but this is the if we can answer this question, then it's pretty easy to just get something going that addresses this at the full scope. Otherwise, you're doing the private sector thing and you have that scope, and then you need to encourage the next, or you have the gov sector thing, you have that scope, or you know what I mean? If we answer this question, then we can do it holistically.
Everything I've been bringing up for the last year and a half of my research and has in fact been trying to push the government to do it himself for a while. But due to stuff I won't get into, we see the best path forward for developing this integrated knowledge architecture that I've been always kind of thinking about as dual: one private sector, one government sector. Focusing on the national labs, the government stuff is a separate problem. Convincing the private sector, he thinks the best scalable model would be to start as just a data storage company, right? Saying, hey, a couple customers, you're going to use our peer-to-peer network to store your data, and then we're going to develop our method of interfacing with it and integrating that knowledge, and you're going to be our test subjects, essentially. So like that, he envisions it as the only way to do the private sector is to have a very concrete, like, here's a 5-10 year business plan of how we can sustain enough money just by building up a customer base of data storage, while we're using that to help them have better ways to interface with it. And then once we get big enough, the government side stuff, where we've been developing the manifold latent space, we can then combine them, right? But like, that requires my focus to shift in a large way, or at least our organization's focus to shift in a large way, to becoming a profitable data storage company, right? Which, like, here's the question that I guess maybe you could or could not offer on. Why haven't they started to build their own peer-to-peer services if it is efficient and viable? Do they, like any big company that knows a competitor is on the way, they're going to buy out that competitor or be the one that owns the competition, right? So why hasn't AWS and so on and so forth started investing in peer-to-peer networks and offering that as a service? I realized my question was misdirected. What I mean is like a company that has 50 different labs or something like that, and they all have their own pre-existing servers. AWS as a company will be the one to allow you to connect them. Like, not that AWS isn't peer-to-peer. I know that. It's more like you have a bunch of separate databases. AWS as an organization is then going to come in and manage that for you, not to replace it.
Tough to get people to realize that you're storing your data inefficiently. You can't make intelligent decisions based on your data.
Preaching to the choir. I do have a gap in the market if I am leading with a new data integration architecture. If I'm only starting as a data storage technique, then I'm not no value over them. Well, that's the point. His proposal is that you're going to have a lot of trouble going to the ones that have the data management systems, and encouraging them to fund your innovations. You're going to have trouble going to a company that wants data storage and convincing them to, change the way they're doing it. But you could build your own more efficient peer-to-peer network with the emphasis. The goal is to build up a better way for you to eventually interface with it. And thus, you're not investing in in 3 separate companies for this problem. You're investing in one that will build up an architecture that works for everybody. So the thing that I'm trying to build the money to invest my time in and invest real machine learning engineers in, is how do we develop a manifold latent space for all data domains? And that's a lot of lingo that I'm not going to try to explain. But basically, when you take an image, for example, and you take row by row and you convert it into a tabular series, and then you encode that tabular series in the memory of a computer, right? You're really only dealing with 2 data lines, right? Let's say it's your X and then Y and then your intensity. If you increase the data dimensionality up to something like hyperspectral data, or something where time, space, and radar is paired, right? The dimensionality scales dramatically. The only latent space that you can encode those in are topological. And so I have a model for a topological latent space. But the key here is, how do we take a peer-to-peer network of different kinds of data and encode them in a uniform topological latent space? And the key to this is standardization, right? It is something that anybody can do and is being done by separate organizations for specific needs, but there is no standardization. So there's no way to cross context. If the government were to come in and say, hey, we're going to fund a bunch of projects that use this standard method, it would really, like the way the internet started, it would encourage that use of it. Or if we established a standard that was so fucking good and so efficient that other researchers just will want to depend on it. Well, the point is that you need that shared manifold to not remove information from the data, but also to be traceable and to be interpretable. And the conclusion, after talking to all these people that all share in the expression to the government that this is a problem and inefficient, none of them seem to have the solution. And I always come with, okay, the solution is that you train a model that learns that traceability in an unsupervised way, like the UV-Segon stuff that I've been working on, right? So, but you cannot do that unless you have that pre-existing network. So imagine it this way: the traceability of a science question can go all the way back to its fundamental theory, like the optical constant or the math that you use to build that, right? But you cannot go and update that model or consider how it compares to your observation unless you have a scientist that goes back through that whole process and builds that lineage, right? A properly not integrated knowledge network would inherently have that already embedded into the training. And so not only would that help you go back and place information where it would most logically be indexed by the very system that does that searching, but then you could use that pre-trained model to do the querying itself. So you have a mass of data of all these different types, and you literally train the model on how to find what it's looking for. And then once you have that, you have a interfaceable knowledge database that is indexable in a uniform standard way. Here's the thing. How do you build that without convincing those organizations to update their data in that standard uniform way to contribute it to that, right? Like, you could hit this from every different direction and always come to the same end, but one of them requires money. One of them requires the government to be on your side. Another one, it's all these different possible ways of approaching it. And I'm at this like cusp of everybody says this is a fucking good idea, and they all say all of these will work. I need to pick one. If I have 10 different ways of presenting it, depending on who I'm presenting it to. If I'm talking to a remote sensing geoscientist, we're all in agreement that the problem is getting access to this data and how we interface with it. If you talk to a tech billionaire who currently is throwing hundreds of billions of dollars into data centers to do the compute, well, you could be like, hey, we have the compute, we have the stored data, but we don't have any way of interfacing with it. And if you're going to pay people to interface with it, you're going to do that repeatedly over and over again for the same data endlessly. You're never going to have that shared and universal context that you can then build upon. And they've already been wasting tons and tons of money and effort on this. And so that's why there are like late stage career people that are like, hey, what the fuck's going on? And so I'm at this really good position to be like, holy shit, I can lead this and convince you to do this. But I have 50 different ways of approaching it, and all of them are like good. But, if I'm in competition with AWS in one of these paths, there's no fucking way I'm doing that, right? But if I can find one of these organizations that has thought about the problem and said, okay, this is not worth our effort, but is now realizing because of the transformer LLM era, companies are really going to want this. And 5, 10, 15 years from now, they're going to be throwing money at it. And if I'm ready, that can be my fucking money. It's not, but that's the thing is like, if you target all of these different markets, you start to realize that all data has a manifold structure, right? And if all different types of data has its own manifold structure, can you find a universal shared latent space to work through that? Literally, the only reason that we have the internet today is because we started to standardize things, right? So like that is the key to the lock, is you need to start a standardization that a lot of people like and start to use, and it snowballs from there. Until then, you have all of these disparate efforts to standardize within sector that can't be cross-compatible. And then the only reason you make significant innovations in the technology is if somebody like me discovers, oh, use this for that. And now I'm realizing I'm going to spend my entire fucking career doing that instead of just addressing the problem at its root, right? So they're not going to go and focus on standardizing a tool that other people can use. They're going to build an open source tool that then or they're going to sell it to you, right? So and you also, we're like, I'm still too early to this. The way he presented it was like, hey, I did this 8 years ago. I was way too early. You are like right at just the right time, but you're still not going to be able to approach OpenAI right now and convince them that this is their problem. 5 years from now, they're going to realize it's a problem, and then they could come to you if they know that you're the resource for it. See, what I'm not trying to create is a list of things that hits all of the buckets. I'm trying to create a general form that inevitably will include all of the buckets. The analogy I used is HDMI was a way of doing video that, as long as we all agree it works, but it doesn't universally work, right? However, PCIe is an example of something that more universally you can build a fundamental piece of hardware that interfaces with it, and then you can add adapters onto there. You're not going to lose connectivity. You're not going to lose, So I try to like build that analogy out to describe the idea that this needs to be such a generalized form that even when we are creating new types of data, they will still be usable in this. I am already working on, and there are already people working on trying to convince them to do it. To basically take all of our national labs, all of our separate data centers, and connect them into one standardized universal knowledge integrated. And the reason is because they're throwing money at AI teams to do stuff like the thing that I'm working on for them. And it's essentially paying people to curate data over and over and over again and never actually save it in one way. And so they're funding these particular to national security and information database for like defense stuff, right? So obviously that wouldn't be integrated into a public database, but the fact that they're investing in these discrete situations, and then later they're going to realize, oh wait, we should include Landsat data in this, because even though it's, a commercial sector, private sector, citizen thing, the data from that's still helpful for reconnaissance of operations, right? Once you realize that everything is helpful for everything else, it starts to become more and more helpful to get this all into one place. And you don't need any kind of universal infrastructure other than one standard. And that standard doesn't even need to be how you store different types of data sets. It doesn't even need to be where you store it, or all it needs to be is what is the manifold latent space that we bring it to, which means that every one of these databases could be reinterpreted and compressed onto a dispersed ledger, right? That's then immutable, accessible by everyone, and very, very compressed, right? But as soon as that you want to access every bit of that traceability within that compressed latent space, you can expand it out and trace through 50,000 databases to get all of the things that relate to one particular topic. I'm gonna try all three. I mean, I'm not gonna do one. It's just like, in terms of if I can sell it a different way to three different people or three different types of people, then sure. But if I need to take any action on it, or if I need to make a decision about which to take action on, which is going to be the most cost effective for my resource scope, is going to be very different from if I happen to meet somebody who gives a fuck about this, who has a lot of money. You know what I mean? And that's the tough thing. Is thanks for the thoughts. I'm going to get some of these notes down. And well, yeah, I mean, this is always something I'm thinking about. And it seems like every time I talk to someone with any kind of sway in this, they agree. And it's like, okay, if we all agree this is the core issue, then why are we throwing so much fucking money at like doing something like recurating data for a particular purpose? And a lot of the times it's just because the voices that you need to be able to spread across departments and divisions, getting to their table is a lot harder than, the table of the people that throw the money in the first place, right? So they're happy to put $50 million a year at 60 different projects and end up with no progress, even though $500 million a year for one project could prevent you from having to do that for the rest of your lifetime. It's kind of like trying to get them to eat their medicine. So appreciate it.